Tithing, first fruit, and offering. All you need to know about it. Apostle Michael Orokpo. Tithing, first fruits, and offerings are significant practices in Christianity, often emphasized in teachings on financial stewardship and spiritual obedience. Apostle Michael Orokpo, a prominent preacher known for his deep spiritual insights, has addressed these topics extensively. Tithing is the practice of giving a portion of one's income, traditionally 10%, to the church or for God's work. The concept of tithing is deeply rooted in the Bible and has been a long-standing practice in many Christian communities. Here's a detailed look at tithing, including its biblical basis and spiritual significance. Biblical foundation of tithing. Old Testament. Abraham's example. The concept of tithing is first seen in Genesis 14 verses 18 to 20 when Abraham gave a tenth of everything to Melchizedek, a priest of God. This act was a form of worship and acknowledgement of God's provision. Mosaic Law. Tithing was formalized in the Mosaic Law, where Israelites were commanded to give a tenth of their produce, livestock, and other resources to the Levites. Numbers 18:21-24, Leviticus 27 verses 30 to 32. The tithe was considered holy and belonged to God. Prophets. Malachi 3 verse 10 is one of the most frequently cited passages on tithing. It promises that if the people bring their tithes to the storehouse, God will open the windows of heaven and pour out blessings. New Testament. While the New Testament does not explicitly command tithing as it was under the Old Covenant, the principle of generous giving is strongly emphasized, e.g., 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7. Jesus acknowledges the practice of tithing in Matthew 23 verse 23 but stresses that it should not be done at the expense of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Spiritual significance. Honor and obedience. Tithing is seen as a way of honoring God with one's wealth. Proverbs 3 verses 9 to 10. It is an act of obedience and trust, acknowledging God as the source of all blessings. Covenant practice. For many believers, tithing is a covenant practice that aligns them with God's promises of provision and protection. It reflects a commitment to God's kingdom and His work on earth. Faith in action. Tithing requires faith because it involves giving away a portion of one's income. It teaches reliance on God rather than on personal resources. Apostle Michael Orokpo's perspective on tithing. Apostle Michael Orokpo emphasizes that tithing is more than just a financial obligation. It is a spiritual principle that unlocks divine blessings and protection. He often teaches that tithing is a form of covenant relationship with God, where obedience to this principle results in spiritual and material blessings. He also stresses that tithing should be done with the right heart and attitude. It's not just about the act of giving, but about doing so with reverence and gratitude toward God. When done in faith and obedience, tithing is seen as a way to partner with God in His work and to experience the fullness of His blessings. Key takeaways. Percentage. Traditionally, tithing is giving 10% of one's income, but the focus is on the heart and willingness to give. Spiritual discipline. Tithing is a spiritual discipline that demonstrates trust in God's provision. Blessings. Many teachings, including those of Apostle Orokpo, emphasize that faithful tithing brings blessings, protection, and provision from God. Tithing is considered a way of placing God first in finances and acknowledging His lordship over every aspect of life. The concept of firstfruits is another important biblical principle, often discussed alongside tithing and offerings. It involves giving the first and best of one's income, harvest, or resources to God as an act of worship, gratitude, and trust. Here's an in-depth look at firstfruits, including its biblical foundation and significance in Christian teachings, particularly as interpreted by leaders like Apostle Michael Orokpo. Biblical foundation of firstfruits. Old Testament. Initial command. The principle of firstfruits appears in the Old Testament, where God commanded the Israelites to bring the first and best portions of their harvest to Him. This was a way of honoring God and acknowledging Him as the provider. In Exodus 23 verse 19, God instructs, "Bring the best of the firstfruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God." Deuteronomy 26 verses 1 to 11. This passage details the ritual of offering the firstfruits. The Israelites were to bring the first portion of their harvest to the priest as an act of worship, acknowledging God's faithfulness in leading them into the Promised Land. Proverbs 3 verses 9 to 10. This verse reinforces the principle, saying, "Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine." This promise highlights that giving first fruits results in divine blessings. New Testament. Symbolic significance. In the New Testament, Jesus is referred to as the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep, symbolizing his resurrection as the first of many, 1 Corinthians 15 verse 20. While the New Testament doesn't mandate the practice of giving first fruits in the same way as the Old Testament, the principle of prioritizing God in all things, including finances, remains. Generosity and trust. The early Christians demonstrated the spirit of first fruits by giving generously and sacrificially, as seen in Acts 4 verses 32 to 37, where believers sold their possessions to support the work of the church. Spiritual significance. Putting God first. The practice of first fruits is a way of putting God first in your life. By giving the first and best of what you have, you demonstrate that God is your priority and you trust Him to provide for your needs. Symbol of gratitude. Offering first fruits is also an act of gratitude, acknowledging that everything you have comes from God. It's a way of saying thank you for His provision and blessings. Faith and trust. First fruits require faith because it involves giving the first portion, not knowing what the rest of the harvest or income will look like. It's a declaration of trust in God's continued provision. Apostle Michael Orokpo's teachings on first fruits. Apostle Michael Orokpo emphasizes that first fruits are an expression of deep reverence and honor toward God. He teaches that this principle is not merely about giving a financial offering, but about recognizing God as the source of everything. Orokpo often explains that when believers offer their first fruits, they are making a statement of faith, declaring that they trust God to provide the rest. According to Orokpo, first fruits are a powerful way to align with God's blessings. He highlights that giving the first fruits sanctifies the rest of one's resources, leading to divine favor and multiplication. This principle, when practiced with the right heart, unlocks spiritual and material abundance. Key takeaways. Priority. First fruits are about giving God the first and best, not just any portion. Faith and gratitude. The act of giving first fruits is rooted in faith, gratitude, and a recognition of God's provision. Blessings. Many Christian teachings, including those of Apostle Orokpo, emphasize that offering first fruits leads to increased blessings, sanctification of your resources, and divine favor. Practical application. For modern Christians, first fruits might look like giving the first paycheck of the year, the first profit from a business, or the first produce from a garden. It's about setting aside the initial portion for God before using or consuming the rest. The act of giving first fruits is a tangible way of demonstrating trust in God's continued provision and expressing gratitude for His blessings. First fruits, like tithing, is not just a financial practice but a spiritual discipline that reflects a heart committed to putting God first in every area of life. Offerings are a key aspect of Christian giving, distinct from tithes and first fruits, and involve voluntary contributions made to God's work or to support others. Offerings are a reflection of a believer's love, gratitude, and generosity towards God. Here's a detailed look at offerings, their biblical foundation, and their spiritual significance, especially as understood by Christian leaders like Apostle Michael Orokpo. Biblical foundation of offerings. Old Testament. Types of offerings. The Old Testament outlines various types of offerings, including burnt offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and grain offerings. Leviticus 1-7. These offerings were acts of worship, atonement, and thanksgiving to God. Free will offerings. In addition to prescribed offerings, there were free will offerings, which were given voluntarily out of a heart of gratitude. Exodus 35 verse 29. These offerings were not required but were given as an expression of love and devotion to God. Proverbs 11 verses 24-25. The principle of generosity is highlighted here. One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. New Testament. Generosity emphasized. The New Testament shifts the focus from specific types of offerings to the spirit of giving. In 2 Corinthians 9 verses 6-7, Paul writes, Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Support for the church and the needy. Early Christians were encouraged to give generously to support the work of the apostles, the church, and those in need. Acts 4 verses 32 to 35. The practice of offerings in the New Testament emphasized communal support, care for the poor, and the expansion of the gospel. Spiritual significance. Heart of worship. Offerings are considered an act of worship, reflecting a believer's devotion and gratitude towards God. Unlike tithing, which is often seen as an obligation, offerings are voluntary and come from a heart that desires to give back to God out of love. Generosity. The practice of giving offerings cultivates a spirit of generosity. It teaches believers to look beyond their own needs and contribute to the needs of others and the work of God's kingdom. Blessings and favor. Many teachings emphasize that giving offerings brings blessings and favor from God. The Bible speaks of God rewarding those who give generously, not necessarily in material wealth, but in spiritual and personal fulfillment. Apostle Michael Orokpo's teachings on offerings. Apostle Michael Orokpo teaches that offerings are more than just financial contributions. They are expressions of a believer's heart toward God. He emphasizes that offerings should be given freely, without compulsion, and with joy. Orokpo often explains that offerings, when given with the right heart and intention, attract God's favor and blessings. He also stresses that offerings are opportunities for believers to partner with God in His work on earth. Whether it's giving to support the church, help the needy, or fund missionary work, offerings are seen as a way to extend God's love and kingdom to others. Apostle Orokpo encourages believers to be generous in their offerings, reminding them that God rewards those who give out of a sincere and cheerful heart. He highlights that offerings should not be given out of obligation, but as a free expression of gratitude for God's goodness. Key takeaways. Voluntary nature. Offerings are voluntary and come from a heart of worship and generosity. Unlike tithes, which are a set percentage, offerings are given according to what one feels led to contribute. Spiritual act. Offerings are a spiritual act of giving back to God and supporting His work. They reflect a heart aligned with God's purposes and a willingness to contribute to the welfare of others. Blessings and rewards. Teachings, including those from Apostle Orokpo, emphasize that generous giving leads to blessings, both spiritually and materially, as God honors those who give freely and cheerfully. Practical application. In modern Christian practice, offerings can take many forms: financial gifts to the church, donations to charities, contributions to mission work, or even acts of service. The key is that offerings are given willingly and with a heart of gratitude. Whether large or small, offerings are seen as a way to honor God and support His work in the world. Offerings, when given in the right spirit, are powerful expressions of love and faith, aligning the believer with God's blessings and purposes. Key points from Apostle Michael Orokpo. Tithing. It's a non-negotiable principle for covenant blessings. Firstfruits symbolize honoring God with the first and the best, showing trust in His provision. Offerings should be given willingly and joyfully, as they represent love and gratitude towards God. These teachings emphasize that these practices are not just about financial contributions, but about aligning one's heart and priorities with God's will.